This is the second meeting of the Joint Select Committee on the Miscellaneous Provisions Local Government Reform Bill 2019. We have representatives from the Ministry of Rural Development and Local Government, the Ministry of Finance, and the Ministry of Health. I am Clarence Rambarat. I'm chairman of this committee. I would now invite the other members of the committee to introduce themselves, starting on my right.
Kazim Hussain, member.
Khadija Amin, member.
Derup Tiwal, member.
Good afternoon, Garvin Simonet, member.
Jonathan Singh, member.
Good afternoon, Paul Richards, member.
Thank you very much. We are also supported by Ms. Ida Eversley, who is the Deputy Chief Parliamentary Counsel, and Ms. Laura Ramnath, who is the Senior Parliamentary Counsel from the Office of the Chief Parliamentary Counsel. We are also supported by the Secretariat provided by the Parliament. The objectives of this Joint Select Committee is to provide an opportunity for key stakeholders across the country to state their views on this bill that has been laid in the Parliament. We've invited the three entities before us today because we believe that this is an excellent place to start. The Ministry of Rural Development is the ministry that is driving this piece of legislation. The Ministry of Finance has a very critical role in terms of local government reform and what is proposed in the bill. And the Ministry of Health is one of those entities that would have significant impact in the devolution of authority from the ministry to the municipal corporations and also to provide oversight as is proposed in the bill. So I now invite each entity, starting with Ms. Bascom, Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Rural Development and Local Government, followed by the Ministry of Finance, followed by the Ministry of Health, to make your opening remarks. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chair, members of this committee. This is a historic moment for Trinidad and Tobago as we seek to lay end the Miscellaneous Provisions Bill, Local Government Reform Bill 2019. It is a moment which the country has been waiting for since 1962, as various attempts have been made at reform with varying levels of success. I would like to just take the opportunity now in my opening remarks to thank all the public officers from the various ministries who has brought us thus far. In addition, I'd also like to thank the members of the Technical Transition Committee, which included union members from all the 4 unions which represent staff in the various corporations for their input. Without them, this would not have been possible. Thank you.
Ministry of Finance.
Good afternoon, Chair. Good afternoon, members. On behalf of the Ministry of Finance, thank you very much for inviting us to this meeting. It is our pleasure to be here, and we are happy to provide any support that is required.
Ministry of Health.
Mr. Chairman, members of the Joint Select Committee, members of the Ministry of Local Government and Rural Development, the Ministry of Finance, good evening. Firstly, I wish to express my sincere thanks for granting us the opportunity to appear before this committee for this stakeholder engagement session on this important piece of legislation, the Miscellaneous Provisions of Local Government Reform Bill 2019. The Ministry of Health recognizes that the overall government's public health response requires an alignment of its policy and legislative arms. I take this opportunity to remind us all of the constant threat that emerging and re-emerging diseases pose to health and safety for all our citizens. On August 8, 2014, the Director General of WHO declared the Ebola virus outbreak in West Africa as a public health emergency of international concern. Shortly prior, in July 2014, the chikungunya virus came to Trinidad, followed closely on its heels by the Zika virus of 2016. In the more recent past, we have had imported cases of measles virus, a long-forgotten vaccine-preventable disease presenting in our region. First in Antigua and Barbuda in 2018, then aboard a cruise ship which traveled between Curaçao and St. Lucia in 2019. With increasing globalization and the increased migration of persons, the risk of spread of these diseases become a real and present threat, and the Ministry of Health has and continues to play a central role in the control of these epidemics as the competent authority for health in Trinidad and Tobago. As such, I wish to reaffirm the Ministry's commitment in providing these necessary public health functions. This is part of its obligation in preserving the overall health of the population and to continue to work with other public sector entities in achieving this overall objective. Mr. Chair, I thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, the committee has identified at least 8 groups of stakeholders that we would interact with, you being the first group. And apart from what you say today, you also have the opportunity to submit in writing anything you want to add or anything you are unable to provide today. The members of the committee would ask questions and interact with you, and from time to time you may have to indicate to them that you would provide some information subsequently in writing. Now, the committee has also given itself until 3:30 p.m. My job is to manage the committee and manage you and make sure that we fulfill what we're supposed to do. Not that we must leave at 3:30, but we try to manage the time because you have other responsibilities and members have competing responsibilities. So Member Rambachan is going to lead the committee off in terms of the questions that we're going to ask this afternoon. Member Rambachan.
My question has to do with an aspect of the bill, Section 34, and I'll explain it so that maybe the Health Ministry can have a look at it. In the Local Government Reform Bill, Section 34(1), there is no express provision for Chief Public Health Inspector, though it allows for officers and employees as necessary to be employed. But what you have is the Local Government Reform Bill providing that they shall have a staff of chief officers inclusive of the Municipal Director of Health. This is 36(1)(e). Now, this Municipal Health Director, in my view, seems to be the one replacing the Medical Officer of Health. I mean, you can correct me if my interpretation is wrong, right? Section 42. But in Section 43, the Chief Public Health Inspector is directly responsible to the Medical Officer of Health. And where there is no Medical Officer of Health, to the Chief Executive Office, to the CEO. Now, if it is that the Chief Public Health Office Inspector is found to be necessary to the corporation, are they only responsible to the Chief Executive Officer? And where does the Municipal Director of Health therefore stand in all of this? Sounds convoluted. In other words, if the Municipal Director of Health stands in the place of the Medical Officer of Health, is it that the Medical Officer of Health is still included in this bill?
Chair, if I may, Ida Abesley, Deputy Chief Parliamentary Counsel.
Yeah.
No, the post of Medical Officer of Health will no longer be included. So anywhere there's a reference to Medical Officer of Health, the terminology that will be used is the Municipal Director of Health.
Okay. So that's completely eliminated.
Yes, it's a change in terminology for the purposes of the reform.
Okay.
Any other member with a question relating to the provisions on health? Mr. Member Indar Singh?
Yeah, Chairman Amara, and to members of the committee. In the context of, for example, in these regional corporations that currently exist, and we are talking about reform and trying to deal with persons' matters on a timely basis and so on. Do you think, or will the complement of medical personnel or officers be increased in the respective regional corporations? For example, in Kova, there's, I think, at the moment, one officer existing. And to deal with a corporation as large as where you have approximately, I think, 170,000 people living and so on, are we going to increase the complement?
Mr. Chair, I will venture to provide a response. Just to follow up on what my colleague will have indicated as it refers to the municipal director of health. This officer will actually be heading the public health division. As it stands now, the role of providing clinical medical advice or attention at the corporation, I think is limited to the Port of Spain Corporation. If it is that this is a role that has now to be played by the corporation in attending to clinical needs, medical needs of the municipal citizens, then of course additional staffing will be required. But I believe that the issue really has to do with environmental health and public health, which is really the focus of this reformed municipal corporation.
And you spoke, Deputy VS, about environmental and public health. And on page 33 of the proposed bill, and again, for clarification purposes in terms of execution and operationalizing this issue here, I see that on that point, 40, subsection 3 here, for the purposes of this section, occupational disease and the chief inspector has the respective meaning assigned under section 4 of the Occupational Safety and Health Act and so on. And again, from an operational point of view, how is this going to coexist or be reconciled between local government and the occupational safety and health agencies and so on, in terms of a clear demarcation and getting the different agencies to collaborate and work in an efficient manner?
Mr. Chair, the importance of observing the provisions of the Occupational Safety and Health Act cannot be taken lightly. It is the law. And of course, it is expected that observing the provisions of the law would be critical at the reformed municipal corporation. At present, the Ministry of Rural Development and Local Government is in the process of preparing a structure which will be in alignment with this bill. Included in that structure would be provisions for health and safety officers, which definitely will be able to address the concerns of the member.
So you speak of an organizational structure, right? So is it an organizational structure for each, for example, borough corporation, regional of the 14? There's going to be an organizational structure for each one?
Yes, Actually, the approach that the ministry is taking is to categorize municipal corporations in a threefold way: large, medium, and small. And this is based on socio-economic and geopolitical and other realities. So based on the needs of the respective corporations.
The Permanent Secretary, when you tell me about geopolitical and other terminologies, you need to clarify that for me because you are confusing me, and I will ask you to tell me how you came up with the term geopolitical needs and other commentaries that you have used, because you are placing me in a very difficult position now. I am starting to think, well, what is the geopolitical for Cuba or Chaguanas or Port of Spain or San Fernando or Point Fortin and so on? And how you categorizing, I heard you, and I stand to be corrected, small and medium size and so on corporation. I do, and again, now I am using my experience here from an IR point of view. I do not know if you have had the buy-in of the respective unions and so on when you speak about an organizational structure and have these things being signed off and so on. Because when you go in the direction of organizational structure, you are talking about job classifications and so on.
Deputy PS.
Mr. Chair, if it is the desire of the member for me to provide an explanation, I will gladly do so. But remember, I was in the midst of providing a response to the original question.
And I will ask with your permission, if you could guide me, and probably all the members here, how you arrived at the different classification and whatever you would want to provide us for my guidance, and I'm sure all, about this geopolitical and the other terminologies that you used that allowed you to arrive at certain positions here. I would like to be guided in writing if it is possible.
Mr. Chair, and I believe that the extent of my response would really be appropriately done in writing. But just to provide some kind of clarification, the term geopolitical is not something that should cause any alarm for obvious reasons. It really has to do with demographics. The terminology I would have used would be related to providing empirical data, right?
Okay, but DPS, you've already undertaken to provide it in writing. So I want to invite Ms. Eversley first, and then I would direct a question to the Chief Medical Officer.
Chair, I wish to provide some assistance to members. If we look at page, sorry, I'm saying page 39, but let me get the clause properly for you. So clause sorry, I've lost my page, sorry. If we look at the at page 30, clause 33I, in terms of the exercise of the public health, it is recognized that the public health ordinance is what guides the operation of managing the public health issues within a corporation. There has been some concern that sometimes the resources are not sufficient to assist the corporations. It is felt, especially in terms of vector control or clearing an area that may be vacant or that may pose a threat to a community, that it was necessary for the officers within a corporation to be able to enter into premises. Currently, those provisions for entry and the powers reside in the public health officers who fall under the public health ordinance. Since the public health ordinance was passed prior to the 1976 Constitution, the entry requirements fall under the save law provisions, and therefore they can enter at any time without consent. However, if we want to give the public health officers who are now going to be under the corporation, who operate under the corporation, to be able to do that function for their communities, we have to at least formulate and guide how that should happen. So what we have done is we have really tailored it that you would have to get consent to enter. You would enter during the hours, as you'd see in 33I2, of 8 a.m. in the morning and 5 p.m. in the afternoon, but still with the consent. And if you don't obtain consent, then the corporation will have to go and obtain a warrant. So that was how we saw it functioning. It's not that you're taking away any powers, though, from the public health inspectors, who can still have those overriding powers to go into a community if a problem occurs. The corporations themselves have been given the power to employ staff. So in addition to the staff that is there, the corporations always had the power to employ staff, their own staff. What has happened is generally they have taken the staff from the Public Services Commission or the Statutory Authority Service Commission. With the expanded remit of the corporations, it was felt that the corporations should be able to really fully employ persons on their own. So in terms of more public health officers in the corporations, they would be able to do that, to hire and fire. This does not take away from the ability of the Statutory Authorities Commission or the Public Service Commission to put officers, but generally there has been quite a bit of dearth in those numbers coming from the commission. So this is in order to bolster the corporations. The corporations are given the power under 34, new 34(2). The subject is 34A, a corporation may employ such persons as it considers necessary for the due performance of its functions and to set the qualifications for the posts, but the terms and the conditions would be set by the CPO. Also, in terms of insect vector, which is one of the huge concerns for corporations, and in terms of the spraying and things like that, specific provisions were put in section 43 and 43 big A in terms of the relationship between the municipal corporation and the insect vector division, which remains in the Ministry of Health. The Ministry of Health has always indicated to us that spraying has to be done in a controlled manner, for overspraying can result in the pest being immune to the insecticide that is sprayed. It was felt, therefore, that there must be a collaboration between the corporations and the Ministry of Health in training and developing guidelines, and that is what section 43 big A seeks to do. Also, in terms of occupational diseases and infectious diseases, since that role still remains with the Chief Medical Officer under the Ministry of Health, it was felt there must be a reporting line between the corporations where incidences occur and the Ministry of Health, because the Ministry of Health would then respond in a global way to the entire community. I hope that provided some assistance.
Thank you very much. Member Ramachandran.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to ask the officer, are you then suggesting, and in clear language, right, that public health officers and public health inspectors are virtually going to have the same powers? Because right now in local government corporations, public health officers tell you they don't have powers and they cannot do X, Y, and Z. Are you now suggesting that this law empowers public health officers in corporations to the same level of public health inspectors, and you would not have that excuse that they can't go and do the job that they're supposed to do?
Chair, if I may?
Yes, please.
To some extent, except whereas a public health inspector under the Ministry of Health can go in at any time without consent. In the corporation, the public health, the inspector will have to operate between the hours of 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. and must get consent of the owner to enter or remove or seize anything. If not, they can approach a court for a warrant, a magistrate for a warrant.
Okay, I know, but is there, what happens to the public health officer? Because you just said the public health inspector of the municipal corporation can go in. What happens to the powers of the public health officers in the corporation? Are those powers being upgraded? Or is everybody is going to be called a public health inspector? Is there a change in the name of the officers, or do they remain public health officers with new powers, or are they going to remain public health officers with the same constraints? Then we are in the same boat.
Sorry, Chair. I'm sorry if I was using the wrong terminology. The ones who are in the municipalities would be municipal officers of health. Public health inspectors remain under the public health ordinance. The municipal officers of health will have the powers that I have described of being able to enter between 8 and 5, but with consent, and if not, they have to obtain a warrant of the court. It's only those who fall under the Ministry of Health have the ability to enter at any time without consent.
So the public health officers, sorry, Chairman, the public health officers who exist now, they can only operate if there's a municipal director of health present. What happens to you are saying only the municipal director can enter, right?
No, Chair. No, Chair, sorry. I'm saying that anyone under the municipal corporation who is a municipal officer of health, that includes the municipal director who will be the head, would be able to enter between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. with consent.
If I could give another dimension to that question. The person authorized by the Act is the municipal officer of health. And his powers could be delegated to an officer within his department, because it says a person in the municipal corporation exercising powers assigned by the public health ordinance. Am I correct? So, quite frankly, there are many instances where in various departments, the engineering department, for example, the engineer may assign an officer to carry out certain duties. Is it that the public officer of health under the municipal corporations could delegate an officer and authorize this officer to go out on behalf of the municipal corporation?
Well, because we've created, in the document seeks to create divisions in the corporations. So you would have a division that is responsible for public health, which will be headed by the municipal director of health. So any instructions he gives to his officers or the officers who are employed in that division would have the powers of municipal officers of health.
I have two areas of concern on this. One, usually a specific post, a specific officer is given the authority. So that way that person is held accountable. That officer can delegate field visits, assessments, any duties like that. It happens with the building inspector, for instance. The building inspector has the authority, but he can direct an officer within his department to carry out certain duties. The engineer, the same thing. So I'm hoping that that is what would happen with this new provision, that a specific officer, the municipal director of health perhaps, should be assigned the power. And if he delegates that to an officer within his department, he still remains ultimately accountable. So that is one where the accountability is concerned. Secondly, a corporation is a legal entity, and it usually operates under the council's approval and especially for any decision that might have some legal ramification later down. If a person who is the owner of a land, of premises that are entered upon by the municipal director of health wishes to challenge the authority on which these people entered, He wants to challenge that it didn't come within the specific period of time or that it didn't have the warrant from the court. That person would send legal notice to the chairman and council because that is the legal body, that is the legal entity. So any decision that could have such an impact should have council approval. And I don't see anywhere here where council approval is required before entering. So the court warrant is fine. Having the hours, having consent of the owner is good. But whether you have consent of the owner or you have consent of the court, you should have council approval before the municipal director of health enters any private premises. That's my suggestion, because of the legal ramifications if there are any challenges.
Any, Dr. Parasaram, you have an answer?
No, I don't want to speak out of turn. I think it is really for local government to provide that response in terms of how the staff will operate.
Member Richards?
Thank you, Chair. Through you. I just want to go back a bit to get some clarity based on a comment from Mr. Seapaul, and I guess as the PS, Ms. Bascom can respond. And I know you gave an undertaking, Mr. Seapaul, to provide the rationale for the classifications you mentioned. So from my, and I guess our general understanding, you identified classifications of 1, 2, and 3 in terms of the disaggregation of the municipalities. What would that mean in an overall sense for this bill and for the Burgesses in terms of how these 3 or however many classifications that have been identified, and it would be really helpful for us to get a sense of how the parameters under which these classifications were made in terms of your disaggregation of them, because that's very important for our understanding and for the Burgesses and people listening right now. But the direct question now is, what are the implications of these classifications for municipalities and people living in them, given that there's now a clear demarcation of X, Y, and Z, 1, 2, and 3, with these new roles as municipal director of health, etc., and the possible implication of resources for those, and they being able to be, as was touted when the bill was being debated, being given autonomy in several different areas. What are the implications, the main implications? And as Member Ramachan said, in as clear language as possible, because people are looking and listening, and their implications for their lives.
Chair. Mr. Richards, a question. How did you arrive in the first place of going to classify corporations 1, 2, and 3? What kind of hierarchy are you creating in the country? Are you saying and making any subtle suggestions that some people in some parts of the country are more important or less important than other parts of the country? What's the rationale for this? And I must ask this question. You use the term geopolitical. Yeah. And does that term have underlying tones in terms of arriving at a classification? Is there an inbuilt discrimination in terms of the classification?
Certainly not, Mr. Chairman, and let me just give a little backdrop to this exercise that the ministry has embarked upon. It is actually a proactive measure that is in alignment with the proposed section 33H, where the corporations will be responsible for devising their own organizational structure. Making reference to the term classification is not intended to be formal. The ministry sees itself as being responsible for giving embarking on preparing a structure that will be suitable for corporations. And because of the disparity in corporations, for example, the staffing and this organizational structure, the Polar Spain Corporation, is certainly different from that at the Sandy Grande corporations. We have identified certain categories of empirical data that we need to get from corporations, which would put us in good stead to understand what the HR needs of the corporations are. It is not meant to discriminate against any corporation.
Right, and Deputy Permanent Secretary, you have undertaken to provide us with a written submission on the matter. I want to invite any member.
Also, just open, Chairman, don't want to interrupt. I just wanted to get I understand that you're going to provide through you, Chairman.
Yeah.
Apologies.
Member Richards?
That you're going to undertake to give us a clear understanding in writing on what data drove these, if classification is not the word, I apologize, but it seems when you say 1, 2, and 3, there's a classification in bill here to me. That's common sense. What are the implications of these classifications as envisioned by the bill or the ministry presently, in a general sense?
The implications can only be favorable because one can easily understand that if we are to devise an organizational structure and based on what the current realities are, one organizational structure would not fit the needs of all corporations. We are conscious of the cost of this exercise when this is
with respect to, you seem to be reverse engineering the question. I asked what the implications are, and you're saying the implications are favorable. My question was not what specifically is going to be gained overall. I want to know what the implications are going to be for municipality 1 versus 3 versus 5 in terms of your envisioned disaggregation. That's basically what I'm asking. Is it going to be in terms of resources? Is it going to be in terms of the org structure? Is it going to be in terms of the staffing? Is it going to be in terms of the reporting function? I want to get a clear understanding.
Well, just to clarify this situation, this deals principally with the organizational structure and staffing.
Member Indarsingh?
I know, again, and I don't want to contravene the in-house arrangements in relation to the fact that the minister who has line responsibility cannot get directly involved here. But I'm a bit confused, and again, the yearning for the information, because the minister piloted this bill in the House of Representatives, and I would have expected some thing to be told to the House of Representatives and the national community from a policy point of view, what would have guided what we are hearing here today. And if the Deputy Permanent Secretary could be so kind to guide me, because I've read the draft policy on transitioning of local government, and I've not seen anything inside here in terms of what he has alluded to this evening.
Well, Member Indarsingh, if it helps you, this bill has nothing on classification of corporations, which is why I said, let us await the submission. It sounds to me that it is something being worked on, and it is meant to drive the allocation of resources, I prefer that we wait on the written submission of the Deputy Permanent Secretary before we go any further into the discussion.
Well, in that regard, we might as well as hold this meeting here this evening, because if we are sitting here as members of a joint select committee going to move this process forward, and we are in the dark, you are placing me in a very uncomfortable situation as a member of this committee.
Which is why I pointed out at the start that the committee has...
So we seem to have started out in a chaotic, confusion state of affairs here this evening.
With all due respect, Member Indarsingh, we could end up in a chaos if we don't stick to what we've set out to do. We've said that there are 8 groups. We intend to meet all 8 groups. And through the discussions, a lot of things would arise, things that may end up causing... The purpose of this committee is to examine the bill And joint select committees examining a bill with the support of the stakeholders often come up with changes to the bill, so that we are not going to finish this discussion today. And that is why I pointed that out at the start. Questions we ask are going to prompt the stakeholders who appear before us, members of the public who are following, to make written submissions, but also to indicate an interest in even coming before the committee. And I could say with certainty that the issue of structure of the corporation is addressed in the bill, a basic structure. But the bill also recognizes that regional municipal bodies are different, and it gives the municipal corporation the opportunity to staff based on its own needs. There is an issue of classification, which I am interested as you are, based on, I recall hearing the word size being used, and the Deputy Permanent Secretary has indicated that it would be provided in writing, and when that is provided, we'll have the opportunity to invite the ministry again to discuss that matter with us. I just want to ask now, because I don't want the Ministry of Finance to escape our attention, and they are vital to this discussion, and I want to ask Member Simonette.
One question, just for Mr. Seapol, through you, Mr. Chair. When you do your
Don't
report,
get Mr. Seapol in any more trouble.
I hope not to. And it wasn't me got him in trouble, he got himself in trouble, just for the record. Can you provide the data upon which these decisions were made? You know, that's very important. I mean, you know, I'm presuming that the decisions were made based on some sort of outreach and data collection, which drove the policy decision. That's all I'm asking to be included in the report.
Mr. Chairman, the data collection exercise is still in progress.
Right. And there's no policy decision. Right. Thank you very much. Member Simonette, are you going to engage the reps from Finance?
Yes, Chairman.
Proceed.
Thank you very much, Chairman. My question is addressed to the Ministry of Finance and or the Ministry of Rural and Local Government. Are you satisfied that the financial structuring of the bill and the engineering thereto is adequate for providing the autonomy in financial matters to enable corporations to improve the delivery of their services to burgesses? And if so, can you assist the general public and this committee by highlighting what underpins your assurance and confidence in that regard?
To answer the question to you, Chair, I just want to make a few comments with respect to funding for the corporations. In a number of clauses within the bill itself, it talks about how the corporations will access funding for its operations. Presently, the corporations, they raise funds through a number of fees and charges that they use, that they hold, and are also supplemented by releases from central government. The reform tend to speak to the idea of the corporations retaining residential taxes that will supplement their budgets, both recurrent and capital budgets. All right. As you are aware, all corporations of different sizes and different populations. And in that context, you will find that if the corporations will be raising funds through property tax, it will be at varying levels. For their budget in any specific fiscal year, for those corporations that do not have the necessary funding to cover the budget, it is expected, and it's proposed in the legislation, that the Ministry of Finance will supplement the funding needed for the corporations. There will be some that will have larger gaps than others, and these gaps will be dealt with by the Ministry of Finance.
Member Timal.
Yeah, in terms of the in terms of the corporation, given the powers to increase revenue generation and then manage such revenue, other than just the deficit funding coming from the Ministry of Finance, it places on the corporation, to me, a tremendous increase in the whole administrative structure of the corporation. Financial, fiscal management, budgeting, monitoring, all the aspects that come with such increased financial and fiscal responsibility. I see a significant jump. And how are we going to address that in particular?
Through you, Chair, to answer the question, within the proposed legislation, you'll see on this section, there's a section outlined at 35C that talks to the division of the corporation with responsibility for finance, planning, and allocation of resources, and what those responsibilities are. Within those responsibilities, with the reformed municipalities, obviously you will have more resources that the corporation will have to carry on its activities. But there's also a number of areas where the corporation will be able to raise funding by additional activities beyond what the corporation is doing now to raise through its fees and its charges. For instance, I think there's an additional list of responsibilities that have been outlined, an additional list of activities that the corporation could actually go into, which can generate revenue. So the sources of revenue can come from different areas. Through its licenses, fees and charges, through the retention of residential taxes, and through its additional activities that it could engage in to raise funding.
Thank you. Member Ramachan.
Thank you. Chairman, one of the perennial problems of local government corporations is underfunding. And right now, they can't even get money to buy chemicals to spray for the mosquito infestation. They can't repair the defogging machines, or defoggers as you call them. Nothing is happening, and therefore the country is suffering as a result of no funds being provided. The bill doesn't seem to provide any kind of guarantees that you are going to have a certain percentage of the budget like the Tobago House of Assembly has with respect to the carrying out of their functions. So you are left in abeyance. Secondly, you are adding so many new things. For example, the repairs and maintenance of government and government-assisted schools. Where are they going to get the money to do this? Who's going to provide it? You're going to close down EFCL, for example, or you're going to take a portion of the budget from education and allocate it to the corporations on the basis of the number of schools that are in the corporation. I think you have 483 primary schools or something like this in the country. How are you going to allocate money to the corporations? These are the practical issues that are going to be involved in making this bill workable or non-workable. Right now in corporations, Mr. Seapol was a former CEO, so too Mr. Chedi. They should stand here and say what the difficulties they have had to get equipment repaired, so that you cannot even clean drains. You cannot even do anything. You have gangs, what you call gangs, as in the old terminology, now we call it teams, where they are down to 2 persons and they are not being able to employ anybody because there is no funding to employ. So this pie in the sky that you are setting up here in terms of this bill, I love the bill. I love what is intended. I have a vision for local government that is shared in this bill. But the practical reality is that unless you are prepared in the Ministry of Finance to take the people seriously and not carry on what I consider to be over the years as a member of local government to be a very, very, very difficult exercise when we meet to discuss budget, and the manner in which the Ministry of Finance is normally dismissive of the pleas and the presentations, and all you go back to the Ministry of Finance and do is say, this is what we are allocating, you take it or leave it. That is a very dismissive attitude that exists at the Ministry of Finance towards local government, and that has to change if this bill is to be workable and if the citizens of the country and the burgesses are to benefit. It cannot work otherwise. So there has to be a paradigm in terms of how the Ministry of Finance sees its responsibility and how it behaves in terms of the needs of the corporation. Secondly, you are proposing structures in here that require a lot of professional people. Are you providing the kind of funding in the budget that's going to attract the professional cadre that you want here? And thirdly, at that point, I want to know, really and truly, since the corporation, they say, have the power to hire and what have you and so on. I have had the experience of people being hired as medical officers of health in the corporation. They are either retirees who come for a day off. In other words, they do nothing. They absolutely do nothing. And a lot of people, they go back in their private practice and they're not on the job in the corporations. This is very serious. So if you are telling me you want all this done, then I want to know how you're going to attract the right people and you're going to get the people to do the job. You see, Mr. Seapol made a point there about environmental sanitation and hygiene and so on, and seemed to say that this is all that is envisaged, or most of it, for the bill. But when you read the responsibilities of the division of the Ministry of the Division of Health, you will see it's much more than simply environmental sanitation and so on. I give you an example. Inspecting the premises of food handlers, restaurants, markets, and abattoirs to ensure the processing of consumable products are handled in a sanitary manner. When last you really had people closing down an abattoir in this country? When last have you heard about restaurants being closed down in the country? When last have you really gone to the streets and seen the number of food handlers? I know, because as mayor of Chaguanas, I closed down several restaurants, closed them down. I know when the Chinese came in and started to set up the restaurant, I had to go to the Chinese embassy and get the food handling course translated into Chinese so that we could teach them how to handle food and so on in the borough. So this is much more than that. And I do not see these activities even now being carried out with the efficiency that need to be carried out. Investigating public health complaints and abatement of nuisances. I can give you an example at the Pinal Debe Corporation, where the building inspector, a complaint that he investigated, after 46 days, he failed to give the show cause notice recently. How are you going to deal with all of these kinds of matters? Where are you going to get the people, and are you going to provide the money to pay for the people? You see, none of this is going to work unless you have human resources that are competent and you're prepared to pay them, and also you're prepared to provide the money so that the technical and physical resources, the machinery, the equipment and so on, that and support people in their jobs are required. Otherwise, you're going to have a situation where people are coming to work every day in corporations, as they are doing right now. The equipment is not working, and this country is suffering a terrible loss in productivity and in finance because of that. What are you in the Ministry of Finance prepared to do about the resourcing of local government corporations?
Chairman, if I could.
Member Richards.
Thank you, Chairman. Just to follow Member Rambachan's concerns about the comments provided by Mr. Manzano on the funding for corporations in terms of the municipalities collecting their residential land taxes. And it may seem to work on paper where the more densely populated municipalities, you would have a tendency to generate more revenue from land and building, residential, and land taxes. And the rural areas, which are less densely populated, would have, according to your comments, and please correct me if I'm wrong, have the shortfall provided by the Ministry of Finance. My opinion of laws is they're supposed to, and especially in this case, which to me seeks to equalize the playing field and aims at devolution, there should be systems or provisions in the law that mandate a particular minimum from the Ministry of Finance. Because what has happened in the past is that when it's all well and good to say, well, the densely populated municipalities can provide funding at a large scale for their recurrent and supplemental budgets. But in times of lean, and we all know Trinidad can go through that from time to time, Trinidad and Tobago, sorry. What will happen is the rural communities in particular, and those that are densely populated, will continue to suffer. So I think it's really important to put provisions in here as safeguards so that all municipalities get some sort of basic funding. And there's as Member Rambachan and others in the debate have indicated, that like the Tobago House of Assembly, there is a minimal contribution so that there is, especially with these new provisions for operations, there's a minimal provision from the Ministry of Finance for a particular shortfall if the municipality is unable to generate it because of limited generation of funds through residential and land taxes and other opportunities.
Thank you.
I think it's important to note that while the corporations are going to be allowed to collect property taxes, they are only collecting property taxes on residential properties. So, for example, a corporation like the Kuva Tabaki Talpa Regional Corporation, which is one of the largest corporations, and where there are so many rural communities, they are not going to be allowed to tap into Point Lisa's estate.
Commercial or industrial.
Yeah, commercial and industrial. More than that, Ministry of Finance will tell you that in the bill, it states that if your budget is $100 million, and you collect property taxes of $50 million, that is deducted from the $100 million. So you don't have $100 million being given to you by the Ministry of Finance. You have already $50 million being given to you. And so if there's a shortfall down the road there, you're not sure to get that from the ministry. And therefore, I want to agree with Mr. Paul Richards, the member, in stating that what guarantees there are going to be. Otherwise, you're going to frustrate the whole process, and you're going to frustrate the burgesses who are paying taxes.
Thank you. Member Bindar Singh.
Yes, and I want to, Chairman, endorse fully what has been said by Dr. Rambachan and Mr. Paul Richards, because, and again, I think that the clarification needs to be sought. When Member Rambachan spoke about the expertise that will be required, let us say from a school repair point of view, whether it is quantity surveyor, civil engineer, in terms of the repairs of bridges and so on. I am asking the question again, under what terms and conditions will they be hired? Will it be contract labor? What will be the role of the chief personnel officer? I have seen here also about a pension plan being created. Is it for the monthly paid personnel? What will happen to the daily rated? Because the daily rated employees have been crying out for the establishment of a pension plan based on an agreement that they signed with the Manning administration in 1994, and I am in possession of correspondences and commitments that would have been given and signed off that I could pass on for the benefit of all members of this committee and so on. So I think, again, we need that information if we are to understand what is going to happen here. Because at the end of the day, if we do not get that clarification, then we will be failing everybody in terms of what we are touting to be this historic day as it relates to local government transformation and so on. And as the Member of Parliament for Kuva South, Member Rambachan's touched a very important issue about the Point Lisas industrial estate and what income could be derived from the stakeholders on that industrial estate from the point of view of property tax and so on. And these are things that I think we should all give due consideration.
Thank you.
Yes, Chairman, for example.
Rambachan?
Yeah, for example, Point Lisas.
Rambachan, would you give way?
Sure.
Thank you. Chairman, through you. Could the Ministry of Finance share with us its sense of confidence in the changes that are made in the bill that will boost or the revenue of corporations, such as does not now exist? There seems to be a concern that there will be a shortfall, or there could be a shortfall that would lead to some diminution in services. Would you care to share that with us? Including, for example, whether you have run any kind of econometric analysis of what the impact of property tax, which has not been collected in this country for a long time, will have on corporations' revenues.
Chairman,
Ministry of Finance, just now. Ministry of Finance.
Well, I know you talked to the idea of providing the level of assurance to cover the fiscal needs of each corporation. My comment is this will definitely be driven by each corporation's budgetary needs when they meet with the Ministry of Finance. As you know, there's a process. The bill talks to the change in the dynamics of going through the ministry of the existing Ministry of Local Government. They will be dealing directly with the Minister of Finance. And I can tell you that it will go through the normal, rigorous budgetary process, collaboration with each corporation or each municipality to ensure that there is some conversions on what their budgetary needs are, and they will get the financing that they need.
Okay, thank you. Let me, okay, wait. The microphone, yeah.
That's a wonderful sentiment, and I appreciate it, but that gives no one any guarantees, because it's still at the behest of the Ministry of Finance.
Okay,
Yes,
members, okay.
Chairman.
Let me just make this point. No matter how you frame this question and this discussion, this bill, unlike the THA, does not have a basic funding mechanism. That has been raised already, and in summing up the discussion, I would ask certain things of the Ministry of Finance and all the other stakeholders. But that we've established that is a desire of some of the members, and it does not exist in the bill. We'll proceed like this with Member Rambachan.
Chair, I've been trying to get your attention.
Yeah, Member Rambachan, who was cut off by my colleague, Mr. Simonet. Member Amin, followed by Member Indarsingh.
Issue for a moment. Here is Point Lisas that could pose a threat to the environment. It could be a disaster in the making, to use those words in inverted commas. And yet, the local government corporation, which sits there, Kuva Tawakit, is called upon to be the first responder in terms of disaster. But they are undersourced and underfinanced to be a first responder, begging this embassy and that embassy for some little piece of equipment and so on, which I think very often is really, really very, it's bad in my view to go begging like that for things that you should be providing. What can we do in this bill to make sure that in areas that are designated industrial zones or industrial areas, that those companies, a portion of that money that comes there from the taxes is allocated to disaster management and disaster funding, whether it be in terms of the gas plant in Point 14 or the Point Lisas estate there or other estates, so that you have disaster management at local government, people who have to be first responders, that they have the funding to so do. Secondly, in terms of the Ministry of Finance, corporations are often asked to provide a development plan. I can see under the 4-year term that each corporation should have a development plan. Under this development plan, there should be some kind of contractual relationship. You said that the bill doesn't provide for a percentage, but there should be some kind of contractual relationship between the ministries and the corporations that will allow these plans to be put in effect by the ministry guaranteeing that on an annual basis they will fund this regional development plan in the different areas. So it will be up to the corporations to present their development plans in terms of priority, which will involve consultation with their burgesses and what have you. So you come to an agreed community plan, as it were, a regional plan. But there must be some kind of contractual relationship, contracted relationship signed in writing. Because here I don't trust that the Ministry of Finance is going to really provide that kind of support. I have gone through the experience. And I went before the table with the Ministry of Finance, and the only thing I didn't do one time was actually cry.
You've gone through the experience in your own administration.
I've gone through the experience in my own administration, but the corporations during my time will tell you that they were supported to an extent that they have never seen support before.
Okay.
So I just want to put this forward because I think it's workable.
Yeah.
But you have to have a contracted relationship.
Thank you. Member Amin?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by agreeing with the representative from Ministry of Finance who indicated that the process for applying for funding to the Ministry of Finance is a rigorous one. And I think former Minister Rambachan was alluding to that his experience, or any minister would experience, dealing with the procedures required for funding to go to any state agency. I want to endorse very briefly, without going through the points again, the need for corporations to have a certain basal figure guaranteed in terms of financial allocation. I also want to recognize that corporations don't necessarily have the same needs, same financial requirements. And in the case of THA, where you have a percentage of the national budget guaranteed, I think if we are going to do true reform, we must start by putting these corporations on a good footing. Has there been a needs assessment for the financial requirements of each regional corporation? Or are we still going to work with an arbitrary figure based on the generosity or lack thereof by a Minister of Finance or technocrats in the Ministry of Finance who are not connected to the communities that have these requirements? And quite frankly, it is still the latter. I really don't see any reform with regards to finance. Each regional corporation has a different number of schools. They have a different number of state buildings. One of the requirements here, in fact, all of their facilities, markets and abattoirs, the request for disaster management based on the geography. You have the the hills, the northern range, you have the river basins where the requirements are different. One of the responsibilities of Regional Corporation of Municipal Corporations in the 13th schedule is local economic development. That is a whole area by itself that requires expertise of a certain kind. It requires investment in a way that would not yield immediate measurable results. And it requires long-term investment. There is no space for that here. I have been a chairman of a corporation. I have been a councillor since 2003, and I've been hearing about local economic development. It's a buzzword. It's a term that really has had no meaningful space in terms of local development. And I still do not see any provision that would change that in law in this new piece of legislation. And I want to endorse the point about making these positions attractive to professionals. I served as the chairman of a regional corporation, and the financial advisor to my council was a very strict, no-nonsense woman who, thanks to her guidance, I served an entire term without any issues of financial wrongdoing or any impropriety by not myself, but by the corporation, because we were guided to make sound decisions. Can we attract professionals into regional corporations with a one-year contract? The proposal here is to have these professionals on contract still. And there are advantages because the chairman, if they have someone who they're not working well with, they could get another person, and that is something we know chairman of regional corporations might find favorable. But for this one-year term, what is the attraction for a professional? That is still absent. So I really am not seeing any change, any reform where the financial procedure for finance, it is the same procedure except that the corporation will be negotiating directly with the Ministry of Finance. And quite frankly, that might be a disadvantage. I was a chairman of a regional corporation, and I don't think myself or my CEO would have had the capacity to negotiate with the people at the Ministry of Finance. The minister did that on our behalf, and I'm thankful because we were able to get the funding that we were allocated. There are no provisions for the allocations coming within a certain period of time. Regional corporations at present are denied, or the funding is suppressed. The release of funding is suppressed for most of the financial year. And in the last quarter, they get a bulk of their releases at a time when they cannot make good. Before the end of the financial year, they can't spend out the money. They can't utilize the money, although they need it. And they are constantly abused because there are no protections in place. That has not changed as well. So, Mr. Chairman, I hope that in terms of point form, these issues can be addressed. And if someone could indicate the intention with the local economic development and where we're going with that in this reform.
Okay, thank you, Member Indar Singh.
That's again based on this whole question of funding and the deficit and the gap and so on, because I heard Mr. Manzano indicate about in the direction of each corporation will have the opportunity to implement new initiatives from a revenue generating point of view. So is it from a Ministry of Finance point of view, based on how this will be rolled out, are we telling the regional corporations that in order to fund this deficit gap and so on, to implement a slew of taxation on the burgesses?
Well, that would be a matter of policy, Mr. Manzano, wouldn't it be?
Well, the Chair, the idea is not to ask the corporations to actually strive or go out to get new activities that will generate revenue in order to supplement the budget. I don't think that is the policy direction. What has been identified in the early stages, at the stage when the policy document was developed, is that there are a number of areas that corporations and municipalities could engage in certain activities that is revenue generating, and that could help supplement their budget. It is not the idea about telling the corporation that if you don't do more activities, then we'll have a larger gap to fill. I don't think that is the idea.
Okay, Member Richards.
Thank you, Chairman. I just want to change direction a bit and go to 35J. And this deals with the division of the corporation with responsibility for disaster management shall be responsible for, and it goes from A to I. And I guess this question is directed at the Ministry of Local Government. In terms of what is envisioned for this, each corporation will have its own division for dealing with disaster management. Each corporation has different risk profiles in terms of disaster management in Trinidad and Tobago. Some have coastal issues, some have chemical, toxic oil spill issues, some have earthquake issues, some have flooding issues, and some, quite frankly, which may in some construct fall under this, some have law enforcement issues, which is also in some can be considered loss of life. And these issues now have to do with imminent life and death issues. And how is it envisioned to work, given the fact that presently the disaster management intervention mechanism in the country goes through local government. In some instances, national security gets involved, working in conjunction with the ODPM. And now this is calling for planning and coordination monitoring, be advising the council on progress and constraints in disaster management for all matters, and all is very important there. C, which is of big concern to me, warning the public of an imminent danger and predicting its effects. How is a corporation doing that? I don't know corporations have media houses or access to that kind of warning system, which may involve lives being in imminent danger. And liaising with the Office of Disaster Preparedness for 14 different corporations with different structures, given the risk profiles of each of the municipalities, data collection and dissemination system, formulating disaster prevention mitigation. As I said before, each is peculiar in different ways. Some will have a much greater risk profile on a daily basis. Some will have a heavy risk profile going into this rainy season and hurricane season, and updating and the necessary measures. So what is the overall vision for this, given what occurs now, and given if this transition were to occur, let's say in 6 months, getting all these things in place, because this is not even money now, this is life and death. And that is a completely different level of consideration in the country.
So, Chairman, the issue of disaster management is viewed very, very seriously at the Ministry of Rural Development and Local Government, as it is now. Each municipal corporation is outfitted with a disaster management unit. Based on this particular bill that we are discussing, as part of our fact-finding exercise that I will have alluded to earlier, and based on the issues and concerns highlighted by the member, the teams or the units at the municipal corporations, based on the data collected, we would be able to recommend suitably structured units. However, the issue of disaster management goes way beyond the resources that the corporations are themselves able to provide. At present, the ministry has been working very assiduously since March to spread the word, so to speak, of disaster management to all communities in Trinidad. And this has been done under the form of developing community emergency response teams, CERTs. Right? Because we will have recognized that while municipal corporations are termed to be the first responders, we essentially are not. The first responder may be your neighbor.
DPS, right? I don't want to go into a disaster management. What Member Richards has asked, he's pointed specifically to the bill and recognizes that the bill requires corporations to share information, to communicate to members of the public, share information, develop capacity to be able to respond. And my understanding is that he's focused on readiness in the context of the bill. How ready are the corporations? I was in another JSC where you presented on disaster management, so there might be gaps that you're trying to fill. And the current capacity, and again, whether there are gaps that require filling to be able to carry out the statutory responsibilities envisaged in the bill.
Add, Mr. Chairman, through you. And if they have been developed while you try to build capacity in any of these corporations as envisioned by the provisions in the bill, because what happens in other jurisdictions is we don't have a federal system, but if it gets to a point where the municipality can handle it and they realize the decision has to be made, something is triggered, so there's a higher level of responsiveness at the state level to mitigate the possible loss of life and or significant injury. Is that also in
Yeah, and there is a separate, later on amongst the stakeholders, we plan to engage is the ODPM, and it might be useful at that stage if the specific disaster management people from the ministry could appear on that occasion, but you can proceed to answer Member Richards.
Mr. Chairman, we, the ministry, are trying our best to be as prepared as we can be. I would have alluded to CERTs at the community level. We have been closely interacting with the ODPM as well as other with NGOs and CBOs with respect to...
I could just interrupt you and give you an example through the chairman. On the day of the Greenville floods last year, it happened so in such a way that while the community, and we focus on Greenville because it was the epicenter of a lot of coverage, but that disaster really happened over a large swath of the country. And each of the various areas was struggling in their own way to cope. And one of the concerns expressed, or many of the concerns expressed in people doing sorts of postmortems thereafter, was that until the state took over at some level, there was a significant disarray between the corporations liaising with the ODPM and the information getting between all agencies. So much so that, thank God, there was no loss of life, but we could well imagine in a similar situation if these processes and these hierarchies of various agencies and state level kicking in, it could be extremely disastrous in many different areas if it were to happen on that scale nationally. And that's why I'm asking if all those various complexities have been sorted out and provided for in the clauses and in the interactions between the corporations, the ODPM, Ministry of National Security, Ministry of Communication, etc. Because just saying it's going to happen is not necessarily facilitating it happening on paper, so people know what to do, when to do it, and how to do it in a structured manner to save lives.
Okay, I'm going to invite the last two questions now, one from Member Amin and one from Member Rambachan, and then I would do a summary and ask the entities to provide some additional information. In addition, my colleagues may wish to indicate whether they need any additional information in writing at that stage.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to get the guidance of the Ministry, and Ministry of Finance or the Ministry of Local Government. A big part of the discussion about financial autonomy and the claim that this bill will give financial autonomy to regional corporations is a statement that regional corporations will be allowed to collect and keep revenue. Revenue from proposed property tax, revenue from fees, revenue from fines. And I have a few questions with regards to that. What is the incentive to regional corporations to collect fees or to collect revenue on a whole? The usual practice is that if a regional corporation is usually allocated, let's say $20 million, and they collect $2 million in rent in revenue in a particular financial year. In the following year, they will get approval to use that $2 million, and then they will get an allocation of $18 million, because the Ministry of Finance sees that their need is $20 million. So in essence, they are punished for collecting revenue. They get permission to use the revenue, and that is something that happens even now where regional corporations collect fees, and they have from administrative fees such as building fees, use of cemeteries, and so on. So that's one. Secondly, the fees that are, well, the fines such as where municipal police officers ticket for traffic offenses, or where there are fines for improper use of a recreation ground, or something like that. These fines are usually paid to the Ministry of Finance, the Regional Revenue, District Revenue Office. I don't see a provision for that, those monies to be remitted to the regional corporations in any way. And that is something I think you have to put a provision there, so that even if the Ministry of Finance, through the District Revenue Office, collects the fees, it would go back to the corporation. They would keep an account of the amount that is for each corporation and send it back to the corporation. So my question here again comes, where there are traffic fines, it's two groups. The fines for offenses, for any offense that the municipal corporation would give, the municipal corporation's police would give a ticket for, and fees and penalties and so on, right? Of course, you have the administrative fees that regional corporations, most corporations have already set up bank accounts, and the, well, their customers, the public, would pay at the bank and bring back the receipt to the corporation to process their application. So that, I think, is already taken care of. So I want to know what is the procedure to get that money back to the regional corporation.
Ministry of Finance.
Chair, I'm not sure if this procedure has been dealt with. I know during the consultation stage and soon after the consultation, we were working through with our legal counsel on how best to address how these fines will get back to the corporation. I don't know if Ms. Eversley from CPC could add anything to it, but I know there was an early discussion on it.
Ms. Eversley?
Yes, Chair. The issue of fees are to be collected and retained by the corporation, but fines aren't. fines generally, when collected, go into the are collected by a magistrate, paid to the magistrate, and the magistrate is required under law for that to go into the consolidated fund. So that has not changed. It's the fees, and certainly the increase of the fees across the board, as you would see in the various amendments to the various pieces of legislation. At the end of the financial year, because corporations did not have statutory funds, at the end of the financial year, under the Exchequer and Audit Act, all monies in the possession of the corporation, whether through a fee or some other means, even if it was through the collection of taxes under the old house rates, had to be remitted to go back to the consolidated fund. Provision has now been made in this piece of legislation for statutory funds to be established for each corporation. With the establishment of the statutory funds, we have provided, as is provided for the THA, that at the end of the financial year, those monies do not go back into the consolidated fund, but are retained by the corporation for its use.
Well, Chairman, if I may, that is not very different from what happens now, because now at the end of the financial year, a corporation would write to the Ministry of Finance and ask for permission to keep or use the fees that they collected over the last financial year, so they do get use of it. And the other matter is that the lady indicated, where they don't get, where they establish the statutory fund. Chairman, I have a serious concern with that. Regional corporations are urged to spend their development funds, for example, before the end of the financial year, so that they don't lose it, so that it doesn't go back to the consolidated fund. That is their incentive to spend it. If there's a statutory fund, and we have the legislation came with the chairman's fund and so on, unspent balances remain with the corporation. There is no longer that incentive to spend the money, because whether you utilize it or not, you get to keep it.
Member, are you proposing an amendment to the bill?
Yes.
Right, so
I'm suggesting that be changed in terms of the statutory fund.
Right. Okay, noted. Member Rambachan?
Right, thank you. It was not really, it was just a discussion. However, I see in the bill, under page 47 of the bill, I see here that revenue from fees and surcharges and taxes, including property taxes collected, you can keep those. But it says fees, charges, and fines. Yeah. Right, fines.
Administrative.
Now,
administrative fines.
Administrative fines. Well, you know, maybe it says it in the definitions, I don't know. But fines. Now, I am all for a corporation being able to retain fines imposed by litter wardens, because you have to keep environmental management at the top of your mind. I'm all for fines that relate to traffic offenses in the borough, especially parking and so on, regulations and what have you. And if it is that we are constrained by law, I think the bill should give consideration to the establishment of a municipal court. And with the municipal court, what will happen is that the fines are retained by the municipality. And we should think about moving in that particular direction. That's one point. The next point is relating to a point that Member Amin made as to how long it takes to get money from the Ministry of Finance and get it released through corporation, through the Ministry of Local Government. And all I have to say on this is a guidance to the Ministry of Local Government, that you don't have to wait for a budget to be passed in order to get all your projects and project documents ready. That can be done 3 to 4 months before a budget is even discussed in the Parliament. And within 6 weeks of a budget being passed, corporations could have money. And that's what we did when we were in office. So something is wrong with the manner in which the process flow charting is taking place and the number of steps. And you've got to introduce process flow charting and reduce the bureaucracy to get money out there to people. Thirdly, on page 47 again, it says here, under the corporation statutory funds, the corporations can raise money from sums borrowed by the corporation for the purpose of meeting any of its obligations or discharging any of its functions. Now, this is a very important dimension. When I was a member of local government, I tried to get a minister to lend me money in the corporation in order to do development works, and the ministers, never agreed to it. Is this now saying that this corporation on its own can borrow money, or does it now require also, again, the approval of the minister, that without the minister's approval, the corporation is unable to borrow? Because we'll back to square one if that is the case. I want to give you a clear example of what I'm talking about, Chairman, because it's a good example. You have a serious vending problem in Chaguanas. You have what is really, in Chaguanas, an area that could be one of the best parks in central Trinidad, that is now a sort of a mall, but it's a distasteful mall. I have no problems in saying a distasteful mall. It is not to the credit of Chaguanas. If the corporation could have borrowed, as I tried then to borrow, about $40 million and build next to the market a 6 or 7 story building with 3 of those stories allocated to car parking, and at least 2 to 3 allocated for vending, and 1 at the top for entertainment or what have you, you can solve a set of problems in Chaguanas. But would the corporations be allowed to borrow this money, or will the minister have the determination to say whether they can borrow or not? Although the building can serve as its asset for the mortgage and everything else. Are we as the Ministry of Finance prepared to say that we are going to go that full extent of giving the authority to the corporations? Or is this just another statement here in the bill? To what extent are we going to go
let me just say that it would be dependent on the nature of the borrowing and the type of obligations the central government is taking on. For example, 1, guaranteed by government. 2, whether the payments are going to come out of the subvention and be handled directly by the Ministry of Finance. And
Chairman, just to intervene therefore, in the Tobago House of Assembly, did the government guarantee the borrowings of the Tobago House of Assembly?
Well, the authority to borrow was recent, so that is something we could, the Ministry of Finance could get back to us on the whole issue of borrowing. But I want to just now summarize.
But I have my final question,
okay,
which is very important for local government.
Sure.
Now, on page 31, and I'm referring to the page, that's easier to refer to the pages rather than the numbering, because the numbering can be very confusing, right? Page 31, under debut, is something extremely important there in terms of the relationship between the chief executive officer and the mayor and the corporation and the officers of the corporation. It says here, in performing the functions above, the chief executive officer shall act under the supervision and direction of the mayor of the council. So the mayor is assumed to have executive power. However, here comes the crux. All chief officers and employees of a corporation shall take direction and report directly to the chief executive officer of that corporation. Now, I know and you know, the chief executive officers have had poor relationships with councils and with mayors and with chairmen, to the extent that they shut down the corporations. They shut down the corporations. And that continues to happen, permanent secretary, in several corporations. And when you appeal to the minister or the particular permanent secretary, they wait for the term to finish, and nothing happens. Because people don't want to do their duty that they have to do them. Sometimes that duty is very tough. Duty means toughness. So is it that the mayor is being set up here? That the chief executive officer acts under his supervision and direction, but all the other officers act under the direction and report directly to the chief executive officer. So if the chief executive officer decides to shut down that corporation, my friend, he shut it down.
Has the power to do so.
Because all he has to do is to whisper into the ears of those fellas. You know, all you have to cooperate, all you have to come to work today, all you can go on and work slow, or go slow and so on. This is a very serious matter in the bill.
Permanent Secretary, would you respond to that?
It's an interesting scenario. In the current dispensation, the Chief Executive Officer reports to the Permanent Secretary. And this is a similar situation.
So you know where I'm coming from?
Yes, I see where you're coming from. A similar situation could occur even if the CEO reports to the Permanent Secretary.
I just want to add, Ms. Bascom, the reports to and takes directive from is slightly different. So reports to is in terms of them accounting. But at present, the CEO takes direction from the council. So it is a council decision that a CEO must carry out. The present reform here indicates now that the CEO acts under the direction of the mayor. So the mayor could give instruction to a CEO without council's knowledge even, much less approval. So that, I think, must be kept, that the CEO would act under the direction of the council, so that even members who are in the minority or not in the same political party with the chairman or the mayor could still have a say in the decision that is made, and that they would at least be informed. So that's one. And with the member raised the issue is where they take their direction from. That is my concern. Not so much where they report after the action, but where they take direction.
Just one correction, Jim. The council, the municipal council, has to approve what the executive council decides. So they will have the input at the level of the municipal council. But I think more important is this point. The employees and officers, all chief officers, everybody, and employees, shall take direction and report directly to the chief executive officer. So the mayor could tell the chief executive officer, this is what I want you to do. Where is the disciplinary procedure that the mayor can carry out if the chief executive officer refuses to carry out the instructions and act under the direction and supervision of the mayor and council? Yeah.
Okay.
And in addition, I just want to suggest that all decisions of the executive council be subjected to the approval of the whole council. That's for the legal people, right?
Right. So I want to now summarize so that the various entities can submit in writing.
Summarizer, again, in the interest of getting information, I have seen in the 12th schedule of this proposed act that a dispute and grievance procedure found its way into the 12th schedule and the disciplinary code and so on. These things are part and parcel of a collective bargaining process. I don't know the rationale. And in addition to that, is this going to be applicable to the monthly paid? Is this going to be applicable to the daily paid and so on? All these things, I think, needs to be clarified.
Right. So the first one is...
Chairman, my apologies.
Just now. Member Simonette, hold on. The first one is the issue of classification that the DPS raised, and you undertook to provide in writing. The second area is the area of several members raised this issue about funding levels in relation to the staffing that is set out in the bill itself, power to fill additional positions, and the questions were in the context of guarantees of funding, basic levels of funding, comparisons to the THA model, and it would be useful if we get a submission from Ministry of Finance on those matters. The third area related to now three things. One, the issue of the terms and conditions of employment, the pension plan, and whether it extended to monthly and daily rated workers. And the third the third point just raised by member Indarsing on the insertion of the 12th schedule and the extent to which that impacts the collective bargaining process. The fourth area is the issue raised by Member Rambachan on the possibility of having industrial entities, and use the example of Plibdeco, some mechanism in which those entities could be called upon to fund the disaster management activities in municipal corporations. And tied to that is the issue of disaster management raised by Member Richards. And there is a possibility, in addition to discussions we'll have with the ODPM, there's a possibility of the Ministry of Rural Development making a written submission on the work being done in relation to disaster management, particularly fulfilling the possible obligations under this bill and also building capacity. There is the issue of borrowing raised by Member Rambachan with respect to page 47, and the important question is whether the corporations would be able to borrow without Minister of Finance and in particular cabinet approval, and the extent to which they would be able to borrow on their own. And finally, and that is the reference to, the reference on page 31 to the insertion of W213, and that deals with two things. One, the relationship between the mayor and the CEO and subordinates. That is one area. And the second area would be the disciplinary procedure and where that would be found, where a mayor has to invoke disciplinary action against a chief executive officer. So those are the ones I have taken note of. My members of the committee can make any additional requests they wish to for submissions in writing.
Very quickly, on page 8, there's an issue of the remuneration of the mayor, chairman, or alderman of the councillors. And it says that the mayor, alderman, and councillors shall be eligible for such remuneration as may be determined by the minister with responsibility for finance. Why is the minister being given the power to determine the remuneration of the aldermen?
Do you have a recommendation, member?
Well, I know that the Salaries Review Commission has a role to play in this. So I'm wondering whether, what's the rationale? Somebody drafted this bill, so they must have a rationale for putting it in. But I would like to think that this is the purview of the Salaries Review Commission.
Okay, fair enough. Member Timal?
Yeah, and the first point that you highlighted regarding the basis for the classification of regional corps, I think what I would like to see in the written response is to what extent that classification would be used to determine or allocate resources, if it's being done as a basis for determining allocation of resources, if the written response could address that.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the members, Member Simonet, sorry.
I do apologize. Thank you, Chairman. My request is for some information in the first section from Ministry of Finance of assessment or some quantification of what the likely revenues would be from the increased revenue collection powers under this Act. What if we could get some idea of the
projection? Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Member Simona. That's an excellent way to end. I want to thank the representatives from the Ministry of Rural Development and Local Government, the Ministry of Finance, and the Ministry of Health. We've not heard from you, Dr. Parasram, but we do in fact have a separate discussion involving the Ministry of Health and other entities later on. And at that stage, I'm sure you'd be able to the main issue, I'm sure, for members of the public is whether this bill, from the context of the Ministry of Health, would make their lives easier or more complicated. The intention is obviously to make it easier, and by removing some of the layers and removing some of the bureaucracy. I want to thank the members of the committee for their valuable input. I want to thank the Chief Parliamentary Counsel and the officers from the CPC. Ida is here with us, and of course the Secretariat of the Parliament. I want to thank the listeners and viewers and those who would view the rerun later this evening. And I want to say to members of the public, the committee will be issuing a call for submissions in writing, and we look forward to receiving feedback from members of the public. This affects every individual in the country. Local government is one of the most important part of our day-to-day lives, and we invite members of the public at that stage to make their submissions, and also make their submissions to members of parliament and other local government representatives who will appear before us at a later date. Thank you very much. This meeting is now adjourned.